Oh, there's an option to record.
Okay, I got it.
Who's got the fastest computer with the most disk space?
Okay, I use this login twice with two different devices. So I muted the piece in the other room is his attention. So we got half an hour, the four of us. My interest is about thinking about how the new economy would look like. Alex, you have this interest in pushing the logarithmic exponential growth.
So I hope we are fine now.
We're hearing the other room.
I know. How do we?
Yes, but I think this should be finished now.
Okay.
No, Barry, I saw you doing very interesting thinking based from the computer and communication world going to the community building and whatever you call it, communitas. And I looked through some of your blog spaces and I felt to be a communion of subjects, you have to have trust. So much in what you were writing and in earlier mentions on not only having trust, but having a common model. You mentioned Vico and other deep philosophers. I was just wondering where we are and where there are commons, because I worked very much on a term which is called covenant, and I called it an embodied covenant, like a multidimensional frame of references which is embodied, so we can negotiate positions and perspectives and frames, and then come through establishing common frames of references, coming to trust and believing in what someone says, because trust is for me not having to experience it myself, but I can trust you what your observation is. Maybe then I have to check it and compare it with my own experiences. This is what I had when I first looked into some of the blogs you had. Then I thought he must be an engineer like me who looks into scales and communication and not just this binary thing, but more on a community and whatever level. And I was since a long time not so much with this group anymore, because I felt we are not really progressing. There are so many interesting tools like Open Space Online, I think now since 15 or more years, where all these things we have experienced now and already 35 minutes are gone are not needed anymore. Anyway, it looks like you're close to Boston. I should come over to Marblehead again one day and then see. And I'm curious, Stacy, you know Barry personally or you just met by internet?
So I met Barry by internet, and I told him yesterday, to me, he's sort of like a mentor, because he was the first person that reached out to me and asked me to read his work and then put myself into it and have, you know, I was able to jump off with what I had to add, and I really appreciated that. Because we're recording this, though, I would really like it if Barry, if you could just give us like a quick introduction, because you've done so many different things, and I just would like anybody who watches it to be able to know more about you.
Okay, well, I'm 74 years old, which means I'm well past retirement. My career began, well, more than half a century ago. I was always strong in science and math, and so I majored in electrical engineering, and when I went into graduate school, I went into what's called systems science or systems theory. It's an important area, but not a lot of people actually have ever heard of systems science. When I retired and I set up my retirement account with Fidelity, the guy who was setting it up told me he'd never heard of my profession, systems theory, and I had to explain to him what it was. My first 20 years of my career, I was with Bell Telephone Laboratories in central New Jersey, and I was doing network planning for the domestic voice telephone network for that time. That part of my career ended when the federal government, the Department of Justice, filed an antitrust suit against the Bell system, which was at the time a regulated monopoly, but it was a monopoly, and the federal government decided to break up the big monopolies. They tried to break up IBM and failed. They did break up the Bell system and succeeded. And so in the 1980s, my career as a network planner for the Bell system just ceased to exist. I briefly worked for a federally funded research and development center here in the suburbs of Boston, an outfit called MITRE, and I was in the network center there. They'd hired me to work on the communication network for the NASA space station, which had not yet been launched, but that was the plan, is to work out a data communication network for them. However, the funding for that ended within 3 months of my joining MITRE, and after that, all they had was defense work for the Air Force and the CIA, which I had no interest in. I was only interested in life-affirming applications of technology. So after 3 years, I left MITRE and I went over to a company called BBN, which stands for Bolt, Beranek, and Newman. And that's the company that was the prime contractor that developed the first version of the internet. Back in those days, it was called the ARPANET or DARPANET because the project was funded by the Defense Advanced Research Projects Agency, DARPA. But by the time I got to BBN, which was in the 90s, the reason I was there was because the internet was becoming available to go into schools, and also computers in general were going into schools, and the National Science Foundation wanted to develop content promoting the STEM disciplines, science, technology, engineering, mathematics, using computers and the internet. And so I spent 10 years as a visiting scientist there developing online learning communities and other resources for science and STEM education. That ended when the internet went commercial in the late 90s. BBN, because BBN was the original developer of the infrastructure of the internet, the telephone companies wanted to buy up BBN because BBN basically owned the infrastructure of the internet back in those days. And so GTE bought up BBN, and they were interested in just the internet part of it. And then GTE merged with Verizon, or merged with Bell Atlantic to make Verizon. And at that point, it became impractical for our little department to continue because we were getting funded from the National Science Foundation. And they would no longer fund us once we had a large corporate owner. So then I went over with MIT's Media Lab, and we got a grant from the National Science Foundation to develop a mathematical model that I had been working on since the mid-'80s, a model relating emotions to learning. And we did that work at MIT with some colleagues at 3 other universities for about 7 or 8 years. And you can't get NSF funding forever. So after a little bit less than a decade, that ended that project. And so I've been retired since about 2008. I also volunteered at the Science Museum for 25 years, the museum in Boston. So let's see, have I left anything out? Heiner was asking about communities. So in the early 90s, I pioneered online learning communities for young people. We had young people and adults, but this is back before the World Wide Web, when everything was low bandwidth, basically text only, on a teletype style CRT, all done in text. And so I was one of the pioneers of online learning communities, and that's where I developed my initial insights that you refer to as Communitas. That Communitas article was based on a talk that I gave, I think it was in '94, which was a what they called a mud shop. It was a meeting of similar online learning communities or online communities using the MUD Muse Mush technology, the text-only virtual reality technology of that era. So that's, is that enough background, Stacy?
Yes, yes, that's enough background. But the work that you talked about with emotions and learning, that's the paper that you sent to me. That's the one that I'm most interested in. That I think that's where we connect. I don't.
Yeah, and that's my most important work. I began thinking about emotions and learning in the mid '80s, and it's a story that's, if you search for it, you can find it. I've told the backstory. But in the mid '80s, I was working with an adult just a little younger than me. She was a divorcee with two very young children, and she had gone back to the community college. She had a bachelor's in education and was a first grade teacher. And in order to advance her career, she would need to get a master's in education, which she could get from the local community college. And so she did enroll. And one of the required courses was a course that was called Statistics in Education. And she was terrified of this course. Now, of course, I have a very deep background both in math and in math tutoring. So I said, no, don't worry about this. I said, I'll help you, I'll tutor you, mentor you through this course. And she got to chapter 4, which was a chapter on hypothesis testing. Now, I'm a scientist. Hypothesis testing is sort of in your blood if you're doing, theoretical science. But she was absolutely petrified of this subject, and she couldn't even do the homework. So I was using the Socratic method, which is a classical method when you're tutoring a subject like math. And the very first problem that at the back of the chapter was a word problem. The word problem went like this. The principal of an elementary school is surveying all the classrooms to see how the students are doing. And he notices that in some of the classrooms, there are students who are raising their hand and volunteering to recite and participate. And he notices that these are the ones who are getting the high grades. And there are other students who are holding back and reticent and not volunteering to participate, and they're getting low grades. So the principal forms a hypothesis. Hypothesis is being verbal, willing to speak up, causes high grades. Critique the principal's hypothesis. And my correspondent was absolutely stuck. She had no idea how to think about this. So I started using the Socratic method, asking questions to try to structure her thinking step by step. And I was really getting nowhere. I mean, I'd ask a question and I just kind of shrug. And in the Socratic method, if you ask a question and they don't know how to answer it, you ask a simpler question. And if they can't answer that, you ask a simpler question. And eventually you get down to what I call the atomic question, the minimum difficulty question. And I basically, you lay out the alternatives. I say, would you say that being verbal causes high grades? Could it be the other way around, that if you have high grades, that causes you to be verbal? Could it be something else like studying the night before and knowing the answer causes both? Or is it just a coincidence? I sort of tick off, all possible ways to draw arrows of causality between these two correlated events. And she has an epiphany. And when I say she has an epiphany, I mean, it's like fireworks going off. She's screaming at the top of her lungs. This seems to be a very important idea. And I'm starting to reinforce it, and she's screaming, shut up, I got to write this down before I lose it. So that was quite a remarkable prose. What happened?
No, you're good. We hear you.
Okay. I think it was just because I hadn't moved my mouse. So I thought about this episode because when I tutored any technical subject, math or science or whatever, you have gaps and misconceptions in the person's level of knowledge, but often not, very, very fundamental gaps that are so bizarre that you never would have guessed them except by using the Socratic method. And the interesting thing about this person was that she had a lot of anger. Almost everything would trigger an outburst of rage. And I never knew where the rage was coming from. I said, what triggered that? I mean, what's with this anger? I don't get it. And so this was the first time that I saw a strong emotion that wasn't anger. It was what I would call an epiphany, an aha moment. And so I thought about this for a long time because, like anybody, I'm aware of emotions. You see them all the time, but I had never thought about the connection between emotions and learning. And so the more I thought about this, the more I realized that they didn't talk about this in Psych 101 when I took your basic Psych 101. Why didn't they explain the interplay of emotions and learning? Was I absent that day? So as I began to develop my thinking about it, I looked in the literature. I said, well, let me look beyond Psych 101 and see if there's anything in the psychology literature or the learning theory literature on emotions and learning. And essentially, it wasn't there. So I thought, well, that's odd, but let me at least put together a theoretical model connecting emotions and learning. And because my background is strong in math, it was a mathematical model. I defined learning as the time derivative of knowledge. You have a certain amount of knowledge, and then a little while later you have some more knowledge, so you're gaining ground, gaining knowledge over time, and we call that learning. So I simply defined learning as the first derivative using the terms of the calculus, just like velocity is the time derivative of position of a moving object. And then the question is, well, then what's the second derivative? Because if you have something that's changing over time, it has a rate of change, what you'd call the first derivative. If it's motion, you call it velocity. What's the second derivative? And it occurred to me, the second derivative is emotions. And when I began to map this out using the tools of math, I go, this is a really neat model. Why isn't it in the literature? So I began to work on this model, and in the 90s, I thought, well, if this model is any good, if it helps you think about cognition, affect, and learning, the interplay of emotions and learning, then I should be able to use the model to reduce it to practice, to derive best practices for being an educator, whether it's a mentor, a teacher, tutor, whatever, study partner. And so I started volunteering on the weekends at the Museum of Science in the Children's Discovery Space. And I thought, this is a place where I can, see if I can reduce this model to practice and become a better educator to people of, all ages and all walks of life. And I also did the same thing on the internet with the learning communities. And after about a decade, I had enough confidence that the model had merit, and that you could use the model to reason, and you could use the model to derive best practices. And about that time, I had met a public school teacher. He lived out in Western Massachusetts, so he wasn't around that much, but occasionally he would come to Boston for like IEEE meetings and stuff like that. And I met him at a meeting, and we chatted, and he was very interested in the online learning communities because he ran the computer room in his public school. And so I set him up on that, and we became colleagues, professional colleagues. And he had told me in the late 90s that he wanted to go back to UMass Amherst to get an EDD. I think he had a master's in education, and he wanted to get a doctorate in education. And so he enrolled in UMass Amherst to get an EDD. And every time he had to write a paper on some topic, he'd come around and pick my brain. And finally, after he got his EDD, he said, I want to learn how to write grants. I want to learn how to write a grant proposal, for example, the National Science Foundation. He says, that's one of the things you want to be able to do, when you have an EDD and your profession is education. He says, but I need a subject to write about. So I went over with him the emotions and learning model and several other possible topics. And he says, let's pick the emotions and learning model, because nobody ever gets their first grant. It's just for practice. And we'll never get this one, but because it's such a novel, sort of over the hill idea, we'll use it for practice. And so he went to a colleague of mine at MIT, a professor, and enlisted her and another professor to sign on. And they spent about a year writing this grant proposal on emotions and learning. And they submitted it, I think it was in '99, they submitted it. And much to our surprise, it was funded. So we started the project in around 2000, and it ran, I think, for 7 or 8 years in conjunction with the Carnegie Mellon, the group at Carnegie Mellon, and a group at University of Memphis. And the very first peer-reviewed paper that we wrote, I think it was 2001, I went to deliver the paper. We had 3 of us were the authors from the project, and I went to deliver it at the International Conference on Advanced Learning Technology in Madison, Wisconsin. This is the first time I had gone to a conference, I think, probably since I was at Bell Labs. Actually, that's after I went to a conference when I was at MITRE in the late 80s. So I presented the paper, and on the last night of the conference, we're at the banquet, the closing banquet. And I met some nice people there. I was sitting at a table chatting with a lovely young lady that I'd met there, and we were having our dessert. I'm chatting away, and she stops. She says, "Barrett," she says, "they just called your name." I said, "What?" She says, "You just won the Best Theory Paper Award. Get your ass up there." So our very first paper on emotions and learning, right out of the box, won this Best Theory Paper Award at the International Conference on Advanced Learning Technology. And I eventually we wrote a number of peer-reviewed papers in the early 2000s. And eventually, when Google opened their competing encyclopedia called Google Knoll, K-N-O-L, it was a competition to Wikipedia. You can't write an original article in Wikipedia on your own work. That's against the rules in Wikipedia. But on Google Knoll, you could write an ordinary encyclopedia article, and you can be the author of, and report your own work. So the very first version of that paper that Stacy read was the encyclopedia version of the research that I put up on Google Knoll. And after like 2 or 3 years, Google shut down Google Knoll. So I ported all of the Knoll articles over to WordPress. And then because WordPress was frozen, you couldn't edit those articles. When I wanted to update it, I moved it over to Google Sites, where I could do live updates from time to time. So all of that work dates back to 1985, including all of that practice that I did at the Science Museum and on the internet with learning communities and working with people at the Science Museum, and then the NSF project at MIT. And now, so basically, that work is pretty much, most of it was finished by 2008. And it's been sitting there, on the internet all this time. And I'm interested in, sort of the next generation picking up where we left off and taking the work forward. Have I said too much? Or did I leave anything out?
No, I'm glad you got to the part of what you would like to see happen now with your work.
Right. That's really where I mean, at this point, I don't expect to develop the research myself beyond what I have. I mean, not, but I really need to recruit the next generation, people in their 30s, 40s, 50s, maybe even in their 60s, who are interested in this work. First, just to learn it and to use it and find out, what's missing or incorrect or incomplete about it, and, develop to the next level. And I want to do that while I'm still around to, to be a consultant, to help people over the difficult spots. Because, if this sits there on the internet, and I figure, my father died when he was 84. My mother died when she was, I think, 87. So I've got maybe a decade before, lights are out, and I would like to, move this material into the next generation while I still have life and breath.
Thank you. Heiner, did you want to chime in?
I only have a question. Did you ever came across the name Walter Bogen?
Walter Bogen, B-O-G-E-N?
Yes.
That's not ringing any bells. I'd have to double check, but I don't think I know that. I don't think I recognize that name at all.
he was in your field around all this AAAS, NRC, NAS, and whatever group, and the director of education was all these advanced institutions. And as I know some of the acronyms of the companies, not only Meter or whatever, Bell, ATT, and whatever, I work in a similar field of education, which I think is also already waiting since 20 and more years to be brought to life. And if I see a connection, I think I would like also to read this initial paper Stacy was just mentioning. And I feel I'm not a system scientist. Below the general system theory was a general model theory. And models are tangible and they include any kind of science systems and cultural expressions. And to work with that and negotiate that with young people or people who have been young at heart, this is my struggling. I'm happy to have met you finally. And I think we came together that you spoke about the Boston Museum and doing this exploratorium in San Francisco in the early 70s and whatever. I feel we have both a curious mind. I'm not a mathematician. I'm studied geophysics and surveying, but I was also very early in the computer field. But now you're on stage, Stacy. Who are you?
Well, I resonate with Barry's work, but I think that I developed it by living it and by watching the patterns without the aid of a computer. So when this is over, I'm going to look and ask somebody to help me figure out a way to link Barry's work, as well as the paper that I wrote on that, to this video. Hi, Harry. You came to take us home?
Sorry to intrude, but there is a request from the other room to have some extra time. Would you like to wrap up by now, or you want to have some more time?
Either way, we could either listen in on theirs or whatever.
Okay.
I have a few more comments that I could share with Heiner, based on the last thing he said.
Okay, so
you give us 10 minutes?
No, you can. There was a request for another 30 minutes, but what I would suggest now, you finish your conversation and come back in your own time to the main room. How about that?
No, we can say 30 minutes.
Okay.
Why not? We just started.
Okay, great.
For us, because
Enjoy.
I don't know how to get us home.
Okay, thanks. Enjoy.
Thank you.
Thank you.
So to get back to the last thing you were mentioning about community building, when I created these first online learning communities, I didn't think too much initially about how we would have a governance model, self-governance model. But it became clear pretty early on that we needed to construct a self-regulating, self-governance model for the community. And what I had proposed, beyond just a non-violent learning community, because there were a lot of these sites that were just like games, like war game kind of.
Mm-hmm.
I didn't want to have any of this, combat mode stuff in it. So commonplace. And what we settled on, and I was really the pusher behind this, was the social contract governance model. Now you call it a covenant, which is simply a synonym. A social contract is a written kind of covenant, self-governance model. And so starting around 93 through maybe 97, a few of us really worked very hard on constructing a carefully crafted social contract for the community. And among the things that are up on my website are these written social contracts. And I've written about them on my blog as well. And what really became important to me is around 2007 or 8, I was looking on Wikipedia for articles because the group at MIT that I was in was called affective computing, which is computing relating to um, uh, calculations of emotional states and strengths and varieties of emotional states. And there was this whole new discipline of affective computing. Went on to see if there was any article about it. Sure enough, there was an article about affective computing. And it mentioned the founder of the discipline, which was the professor I was working with at MIT. And I realized that they had written a biography about her, a Wikipedia biography. And I read the biography and I was appalled because it had almost nothing about her work and some totally extraneous stuff that I might have known this person for 30 years, whatever it was, 20 some years. So I went to flesh out her biography, and I ran into a huge conflict on Wikipedia with the editors in Wikipedia, and it was terrible. It was awful. And as I worked my way through this weird experience on Wikipedia, trying to edit reliable, accurate content, and running into all these difficulties, it occurred to me, what the hell is the governance model of the editors, the community on Wikipedia? I can't fathom what their governance model is. They don't have anything like conflict resolution. They don't have due process. What the heck is going on here? And eventually I realized that their governance model was so primitive that it predated the invention of the rule of law. It was a pre-Hammurabic ochlocracy. Ochlocracy is a funny word that means mob rule. And basically it's that, whatever little clique was writing heard on some portion of Wikipedia, it was mob rule. There was no sensible method of conflict resolution. And that sort of really drove home the toxicity of social networks, because the phenomenon that I ran into in Wikipedia sort of repeats itself in a lot of online groups. On Facebook groups, you get little fiefdoms and autocracies. And if there's a conflict, the moderator just decides to kick somebody out or shut somebody up, and there's no conflict resolution, there's no due process. And if you contribute a lot of content, you lose access to your content. They kick you out. It's a closed group. You can't even read your own writings in situ and retain access to your own content, which is ridiculous. But that's the way Facebook software is designed. So there was a lesser version of it on social network sites, but it's kind of ubiquitous. And now we have the same thing in politics. In American politics, it's a disaster. And so it's a lot of antisocial activity and very poor conflict resolution and no social contract. And the rule of law has gotten to the point where everybody is openly gaming it. It turns out that mathematically, it's not difficult to game the system if it's rule-based. Mm-hmm. And in American politics, I don't know about European politics, American politics, they openly game the system in a way that's corrupt, but it's not illegal, because you can't write rules to enforce ethics. Ethics is a higher order, deeper thinking than rule-based thinking. And so I've written a lot about governance models and rule-based methods and the problems with the rule of law, because the rule of law is mathematically chaotic. This is one of my big discoveries. Came out of the mathematics of chaos theory. Chaos theory, you try to make chaos on purpose. And the easiest way to make chaos on purpose is to make a few set of rules and follow them. And the obvious example of children's games, chess, checkers, Go, Chinese checkers, Othello, all these board games where it's pure strategy, there's no rolling the dice. There's an astronomical number of legal games of checkers or chess or whatever, and you can't predict what's going to happen more than a few moves ahead. And so that was sort of the obvious demonstration that rule-based systems are mathematically chaotic. But there's actually a very deep mathematical discipline about that. And once people realized that rule-based systems are not orderly, that law and order is a myth, In fact, in America, Law and Order was the name of a drama series. I don't know, maybe they show it in European television syndications or not, but here in America, the Law and Order police procedural ran for, I think, more than a decade. And when it went into syndication on the Turner network, Ted Turner's TNT network, the advertising slogan was, "We know drama." So rule-based systems and politics is just total drama. And it's lunatic drama. And it's not orderly, it's not predictable, and it's downright insane. And the solution really is to upgrade to a social contract model, which uses ethics. But that's hard because most people can't do the calculus of ethics.
Okay, I'm getting a little bit a better feel about you. There is many things I would be able to jump into because I was really into Citizendium and the early days of Wikipedia, and they, through their concepts of meritocracy and mediocracy, they're putting in gangs a reputation up which is not solidified. Anthony Judge from Brussels, I'm often mentioning him, he wrote once an article on Terminator squads. So they have people in the editorial board who are just throwing out the other people, and there are, if they kill 10,000 entries per hour, then they are the masters of the universe, and it has nothing to do with quality. It is just something like a medieval or archaic principle, and that's why I like very much the concept of Citizendium. Have you heard about that?
I remember
Larry Singer developed it.
Larry Sanger was a co-founder of Wikipedia with Jimbo Wales, and they had a big fight. And Jimbo Wales either pushed Sanger out or he left. I don't quite know.
Yes, he was kicked out. I was together with them both. We were here in Berlin, and it was an interesting session. I was also kicked out of Wikipedia some years ago. They called me a vanity, and I didn't know what it means, so I had to look it up.
You mean a vandal?
A vanity.
Vanity.
Not celebrity, but vanity.
Oh, I don't know what that is.
Oh, you don't either. So a vanity seems to be like a celebrity who is putting herself first, and which is bragging. I mean, this is how I understand it. Anyway, it was that they couldn't put me into a certain discipline. And all our concepts are in certain silos. And you use in silo your own terminology. And that's why with our Encyclopedia of Systems and Cybernetics, we take each term and explain in which discipline this term, like leverage point, is understood this way or that way, and going into another chapter into the ontological and epistemological connections. So my interest is what people mean, not what they say. And on that, I try to embody it. And what you meant in your evaluating, qualifying, maybe even emotions, I don't really understand yet what you're doing, but it's very interesting for me because this weighting of different responses, maybe you call this responses emotions, is very important. And we do in the United Nations Democracy Fund project something where we do such group weighting to really see, can the group come to a common ground and go to the root causes and to the deep drivers. And this is what we do in a group. It's called 21st Century Agora.
Yeah.
Anyway, there's much in common if you have a solid, tangible and intangible qualitative and quantitative education. Otherwise, you're hooked immediately into an emotion because you know what is right and what is meant. And so to contextualize that, I was building this embodied covenant, and we did it in the religions because they told me that all these religious groups, they have covenants. So this was maybe on another level the same like you were mentioning, and how to harmonize such schemes of references or frames of references. This is my work, and I also invested lots of years and pains.
Yeah. So I've written about the same topics. Hopefully you'll find some of my comments provide additional depth from what you've already thought about. But in my article on ethics, I talk about the social contract. And it goes all the way back to the Covenant of Moses, the Covenant of Jesus, the Magna Carta, the Mayflower Compact, the US Constitution. There's lots of examples of covenants and social contracts. And then you have the modern sort of 21st century version of it for online communities. So yeah, we've got a lot of overlapping thoughts, and I gather we haven't really, well, I don't know, don't know how much of it you've found and read on my blogs. There's so much material, it's not easy to find it all, but it's cybernetics. I've written about cybernetics on my
Did
blog.
you had a chance to look into our encyclopedia and take certain terms, because it's now online, and then
Which encyclopedia?
Systemspedia.
I don't think I've heard of it. Systemspedia? No.
Yeah, I thought I was sending it to you.
There was something called Encyclopedia Cybernetica like 20 years ago.
Yes, I'm aware of that. No, what this International Encyclopedia of Systems and Cybernetics is about, that some of the very early founders of Bertalanffy and all the general systems groups, they had an interesting guy, Charles François, and he was from Belgium, but raised in Africa, and then he was diplomat in South America. He was really very much in languages and very much in the early steps of Bertalanffy. And there we look very much into how different religions or belief systems or sciences together, because we discussed sectarianism of science. So we are just doing our elbowing, and we call it interdisciplinary, but it's just one group fighting out of a certain disciplines against the other. What I'll do, I have your email. I will send to you both my extended signature, and there you find this Systempedia link. Maybe I mark it red. Okay. And I think this is already a very good start. I was longing to see who is on the other side, and now we got it.
Yeah.
So Stacy, what would you like to do with this work of Barry?
Well, so I'm actually doing his work. I'm living his work. And I think that's how I found him. And I think that's I'm guessing that would be the reason he reached out to me to read that particular article, that he saw something in my conversational skills that he recognized. I mean, I don't know what was in Barry's head, but I'm in lots of different groups where I guess I function as either a benevolent dictator, if it's something that I work myself, or I'll go into groups and using different methods, I'll role model conversational techniques. And I definitely see a decrease in violence in those groups. So right now I'm on the next, I deal a lot with the politics because it created a great playground. It's a great laboratory with everything going on in US politics. So now I'm really you know, because I have to deal with my own emotions, sometimes I just have no patience for trying to affect change. But now I think I've regrouped, and I want to, especially with this new investigation that's come out, it's easy to take, there's a lot of concrete information where I could ask the kind of questions that Barry was asking. In, you said a Socrates, what was it?
Socratic method.
Yes.
You ask questions in the manner of Socrates, called the Maieutic method. Maieutic is a Greek word that basically means midwife. You midwife the epiphany, the discovery learning.
And it's kind of hard for people to stay in a place of denial, especially when they know there's a whole group watching them. So that's where the emotions kick in, because they have this image they want to present, but it becomes difficult. And so what do I want to do? I think that a lot of the problem could be solved if, number one, people were really impeccable with their word. So Heiner, like when you talk about the two different meanings of the word, I would like to use a word that starts with the commonplace, where then it could branch off, as opposed to having two just separate branches that are totally different. And then asking questions to know which direction you're moving in. I don't think there's enough confirmation. So people assume they know what the other person said, and most of the time they're wrong. And then they get angry because they can't understand why a person is behaving in a way when obviously they know what I meant, and they don't know. And that's where, it was the 4 agreements, but Barry added a 5th agreement, and that's where they come in.
You see, I've been in terminology research with UNESCO, very much with these groups who were starting doing the first lexica or word books and then having it translated. And since the Roman, we know that a word is only how other understands him. But the question is how to dig into how does he means it? Does he mean it when he says it now to you? Or I say the same word to my mother or my grandson or whatever? It is always very much context specific.
Precise.
And the meaning is not a single item. So you cannot give it a coordinate in X, Y, Z. It's a spectrum or even a field of meaning. And to really identify how this meaning is shared, it's a mimetic, deep midwifery process where you establish the position, the perspectives, the frames, because all this else is just alphabetic noodle soup, we say.
Yeah.
So everybody is fishing his own meaning. And what we do in this 21st Century Agora peace projects is really trying to come to shared understanding. And there this group developed in the 60s 5 axioms or 7 axioms. This is variety, requisite meaning, parsimony, and very, very deep thought to really go not into bubbling futures, but looking into the normative and participatory futures. So anyway, this is a totally different other story. I am a little bit cautious now in all our exercises we hear in the internet. Nobody is asking, nobody is questioning, and it's not really coming to shared doing. Sometimes people think they understand a word or they put it in a certain slot and then they move on. And so all our modern social web communication is very, very superficial. And what I try, I'm coming to you in a second, is to really embody it, because I'm not just saying embodied covenant, but we were building it. We were building in groups. What do you think, and in which direction, and in which sector, on which magnitudes, in which culture, and with which time horizons, to really make it concrete. And there I'm a map and model maker who has been building it, and we do with young people some constellation work. So you make a constellation not only how you are relating to a topic or your neighbor or your spouse, but how you're relating thematically. So I'm building thematic mind landscapes or whatever. It's difficult to put it in words. I learned that we have to do it, we have to build it, and then to change it. And then not doing it with words, but also with images, with emotions, with senses, with directions. And so it's a very complex issue. And I think I'm done at the moment.
I need to go pee. I'll be back in about a minute.
You are excused.
Great for a recorded message.
Well, I think this is very human. This is okay. I can, in between, try to find this link to this encyclopedia. Or is there anything you want to say?
I'll wait till Barry comes back. I just have one more quick thing to say. But yeah, I don't know how to find the links and add them. That's something I have to learn.
You don't know how to add links?
Well, not to a recording like this. I'm going to have a hard. I'm going to first have to figure out how to take this recording and send it to Tammy.
Okay. Well, the computer will download it, and then you might have to send it in a Dropbox or in a Google space, because if it's more than an hour, then it's already 2 gigabytes or more, and then you cannot send it by email anymore,
Okay.
because this is large data then.
So the only thing I wanted to add to what you had, you were both talking about is just on a relationship level, just person to person, everyday human level. Part of what I see when it comes to questions is that people are afraid to ask the question. They're afraid the question will be insulting, or they're afraid that they'll feel stupid asking the question, and that ties into the emotions. So that's one thing that I don't think gets addressed enough. The other thing that I think sometimes gets overlooked is that sometimes teachers or those that want to teach, they ask the question, but they're not asking to really hear the response.
Yes.
And I think that, and that goes to the individual who's doing the teaching. Are you asking, it goes to the whole, when you're listening, are you listening to understand, or are you listening to respond? And I think that we have to make a conscious effort to really listen to understand. And those are the two things I wanted to add.
And that's hard to do, because how do you know you understood? That your understanding matches what they thought they were sending.
Yes.
You have to close the loop. You have to do active listening. You have to say, here's what I heard you say, and then say, you got it, or no, you didn't get it.
Well, a lot of times I'll say, what do you mean by this? What do you mean by that? So do you think that?
Yeah.
Yes, but still, meaning is not doing.
Yes.
Only when you take it as a new construct and build it anew, and it has the same features, the same appearance, and the same use and pragmatics, then you're there. And
Yeah,
this
build a
is,
working model.
yes.
Model-based learning and building a working model is the only way I know of to be sure that you've understood something, because you built a working model of it.
Mhm. So what I would like to end up, because I think Harry will come in a moment, I think I wrote it to you in one of our first emails or Facebook exchanges. Please look up general model theory. The systems science schools are in at least 4 different quarters, and they're fighting against each other because one is going from energy, the other from process, the other from position, and the others from vectors and whatever. And to bring it together, UNESCO very early said, we humans are model-making animal.
Yeah, I am.
And doing models like architects and planners and artists is to do something extensional, maybe immersive, and then have such collective artistic work going on. So they merge and morph and mend and construct it and tear it apart like in kindergarten. And so the guy who developed this, his name is Herbert Stachowiak. I have 2 meters of stuff he was writing, and he developed all this in the 60s. And then later, he took 20 years on a systemic neo-pragmatism. He said, we have to look into pragmatism. It has to be not only ethical, it has to be doable and shareable and meaningful and all this. And so there is some interesting stuff going on, because he was an artist, a linguist, a system scientist, an airplane builder, and the friend of Konrad Zuse, who developed the German computer. You heard about Konrad Zuse, the German first programmable computer builder.
How do you spell his name?
Konrad Zuse, Z-U-S-E.
I'll have to look that name up. That is not ringing a bell.
He was, I think, the first who did programmable computer in the world. And this Herbert Stachowiak was a friend of him. They were both artists, and they were building airplanes in the early 30s or whatever. Anyway, this is where I have a chance to really show you meters of books if you ever make it to Berlin. I'm here in a more bibliophile book and library environment where we do European vocational training projects to show young people how to build in a community something common. Like we take telephone boxes from various countries in Europe, and the vocational training pupils, they put solar on top, and they do the steel, the glass, the facilities management, the painting, everything, to do reading with the older generation, or to have a community place with the kindergarten or the church parish or whatever is in account, that through media, old and new media, people come together to talk to each other again. Anyway, is there some material about it? I think we have to ground it in practical work we are doing, and it's much fun. It's called Bibliobox or Library Box. I can also send you a link or whatever one day.
Okay.
Okay, Tammy's saying that we can join the room, but I'm not really sure how to do that. Does anybody know how to?
Well, there's an icon on the bottom right that says breakout rooms. It's like
Yes.
2 by 2 button. Do you click that thing?
Oh, maybe. Okay, so
Leave.
before we try that, should we? Well, he's gone already. So Barry, I'll just say thank you so much
My pleasure.
for being here, and thank you. We will be We will be talking shortly, but we're going to go back into the main room right now, okay?
I'm just going to click breakout rooms to see if that does it.
Okay. I wonder, oh, let me stop this.